Miss Marple and the Widow Who Killed Her Husband. Hello, dear listeners, and welcome back to Cafe Tales. I'm Ailey, your host, and it warms my heart to know you're here with us tonight. Tell me, what is it that draws you to these cozy mysteries? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our daily stories. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The Funeral at Fernley House. The November mist clung to the gravestones of St. Mary's churchyard with what Miss Marple could only describe as an almost theatrical persistence. It was the sort of mist that belonged in a Gothic novel, she reflected, though she immediately reproached herself for such a fanciful notion. Death was never theatrical. Not really. It was merely final. She had arrived in Hartwell Rise the previous evening, traveling by train from St. Mary Mead at the earnest request of her cousin Dorothy, who had written in some distress about her dear friend, Mrs. Emily Stroud. Such a tragedy, Dorothy's letter had read. Geoffrey gone so suddenly. Emily is bearing up with remarkable courage. But I know she would be comforted by your presence, Jane. Miss Marple knew what that meant. Dorothy, who possessed a kind heart but perhaps not the most discerning eye, sensed something amiss but could not quite articulate what, and so she had summoned Jane Marple, as one might summon a physician for a persistent but indefinable malady. The funeral service itself had been well attended. Mr. Geoffrey Stroud had been, it seemed, a respected figure in the village, though the eulogies had been oddly general in nature. He was a pillar of the community, devoted to his garden, a man of strong opinions. Miss Marple, who had sat quietly in a back pew between Dorothy and a stout woman who smelled powerfully of camphor, had noted that no one mentioned him being loved or even particularly liked. Now, as the small procession made its way from the graveside back toward the church gate, Miss Marple observed the widow with interest. Mrs. Emily Stroud was perhaps 50, though she might have been younger. She had that curious quality of having been beautiful once, and the ghost of that beauty still lingered in the fine bones of her face and the graceful way she held herself. She wore black naturally, but it was a becoming black, well-cut and elegant. Her veil obscured her features, but her bearing was remarkable. She walked with her head held high, accepting condolences, with a gloved hand extended, her voice low and composed. Too composed, murmured Dorothy in Miss Marple's ear. She hasn't shed a single tear, Jane, not one. Perhaps she shed them all in private, Miss Marple replied mildly, though she filed the observation away in that vast mental catalogue of human behavior she'd been accumulating for 7 decades. Mrs. Stroud is a marvel, declared the Reverend Walters, who had conducted the service. He was a youngish man with earnest eyes and a tendency to clasp his hands together when he spoke. Such fortitude in the face of grief, such Christian dignity. Yes, indeed, said Miss Marple. Tell me, Reverend, had Mr. Stroud been in poor health? Heart trouble? I understand. The vicar's expression flickered with something that might have been uncertainty. Well, I believe it was rather sudden, you see. Dr. Penrose would be the one to ask about such matters. I only know that Mrs. Stroud was most anxious that the funeral take place quickly. She said Geoffrey would have wished it so. No fuss. You understand. How very practical, Miss Marple observed, as they approached the lich gate. A thin, nervous-looking young woman in a maid's uniform hovered at the edge of the group. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she twisted a sodden handkerchief between her fingers. When Mrs. Stroud passed, the maid dropped a curtsy and said something too low to hear. Mrs. Stroud paused, touched the girl's shoulder briefly, and murmured what were presumably words of comfort. The gesture seemed kind, yet Miss Marple noticed how quickly the widow moved on, as though eager to escape the girl's evident distress. That's Alice, the housemaid, Dorothy whispered. Poor thing. She's the one who found him. Indeed, Miss Marple's interest sharpened. How distressing for her. Yes, in his study, slumped in his chair, quite alone, Dorothy said. She lowered her voice even further. Between you and me, Jane, there are some who say Geoffrey had been drinking rather heavily of late. Dear me, said Miss Marple, who recalled that the Reverend Walters had described the deceased as a man of temperate habits in his eulogy not half an hour before. The funeral party was to gather at Fernley House for refreshments. It was a handsome property, set back from the village green behind a neat hedge of yew. The house itself was Georgian, honey-colored stone with ivy climbing one wall in a carefully maintained fashion. Everything about it spoke of prosperity and good taste. Inside, the drawing room had been prepared with quiet efficiency. A long table held cold meats, sandwiches, and cakes. Tea was poured by a local woman whom Dorothy identified as Mrs. Hawkins, a widow who helped out on such occasions. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea and positioned herself in a corner from which she had an excellent view of the room. It was a technique she had perfected over many years. People often spoke more freely when they believed themselves unobserved. Mrs. Stroud moved through her guests with practiced grace, accepting sympathies, offering refreshments. She was every inch the grieving widow. Yet there was something curious that Miss Marple could not quite place. Perhaps it was the way Mrs. Stroud's eyes never quite met anyone's gaze for more than a moment. Or perhaps it was the manner in which she avoided the closed door at the far end of the hall. The study, Miss Marple surmised, where Geoffrey Stroud had died. A dreadful shock, declared Major Morrison, a red-faced gentleman with magnificent white whiskers. Saw Geoffrey only 3 days before, robust as anything, working in his garden, pruning the roses. Asked him how he kept them so fine. His heart, though, ventured a thin woman in navy blue, whom Miss Marple did not recognize. Weak hearts run in families, I believe, do they? The Major looked doubtful. Never heard Geoffrey mention any family trouble of that sort. Ah, but men never do discuss such things, the woman replied. Too proud, Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. A man in excellent health 3 days ago, now dead of heart failure. It happened, of course. Hearts were unpredictable organs, and yet... Miss Marple looked up as Emily Stroud approached, extending both hands. Dorothy has told me so much about you. How kind of you to come such a distance. Not at all, Miss Marple replied, taking the offered hands. They were cold despite the warmth of the room, and trembled very slightly. Please accept my deepest sympathies. You're very kind. Geoffrey would have been touched by such a gathering. He was very particular about such things. I'm sure he was, Miss Marple said gently. It must have been a terrible shock. Yes. The word came quickly, almost too quickly. Yes, it was quite sudden. I had thought, that is, we had hoped. She stopped, pressing her lips together, but added, Dr. Penrose assures me he felt nothing. That is some comfort. Dr. Penrose attended him. He came afterward to certify. Mrs. Stroud's voice trailed off. She glanced away toward the closed study door. I must see to the other guests. Do excuse me. Miss Marple watched her retreat, noting the studied avoidance of the very room where her husband had died. She also noted that Mrs. Stroud had not actually answered the question. As the afternoon wore on and guests began to depart, Miss Marple found herself standing near the hall table. A small stack of calling cards lay in a silver tray, and beside them a single card with black edging. Chapter 2. Tea with the Widow. The following afternoon brought one of those deceptively mild November days that can lull one into believing that winter might, after all, be postponed indefinitely. Miss Marple, having declined Dorothy's suggestion of a drive to see the local Abbey ruins, had instead expressed a wish to call upon Mrs. Stroud. To pay my respects properly, she had explained. Yesterday was hardly the occasion for a real conversation. Dorothy had looked doubtful. Are you quite sure, Jane? Emily may wish to be alone with her grief. Then she will tell me so, Miss Marple replied serenely, and I shall leave at once. But Mrs. Stroud, when the maid Alice announced them, seemed almost relieved to have visitors. She received them in the drawing-room, where afternoon sun slanted through tall windows and caught the dust motes dancing in the air. Miss Marple, Mrs. Peaton, how good of you to call. Emily Stroud wore dove gray today, a concession to half-mourning that somehow made her look younger. I confess the house feels rather large with only Alice and myself rattling about in it. Do sit down. Alice will bring tea. The maid bobbed a curtsy and departed. Miss Marple noted that the girls' hands were still trembling, much as they had been at the funeral. Nerves, perhaps, or something else. You have a lovely home, Miss Marple observed, settling into a chintz-covered chair. And indeed, Fernley House was lovely, almost oppressively so. Every surface gleamed. Every cushion sat at precisely the correct angle. It had the pristine quality of a room prepared for photography rather than habitation. Geoffrey was most particular about order, Mrs. Stroud said, following Miss Marple's gaze. He could not abide clutter or carelessness. The phrasing struck Miss Marple as curious. Not Geoffrey liked things neat, but rather an observation about what he could not tolerate. There was a subtle difference, and in that difference lay a world of meaning. Tea arrived on a silver tray borne by Alice, who set it down with great care and poured with hands that shook only slightly. Miss Marple watched with interest as Mrs. Stroud dismissed the girl with a small gesture. Sugar, Miss Marple? Milk? Just milk. Thank you. You're managing admirably, Mrs. Stroud, if you'll forgive my saying so. One must carry on. Emily Stroud's smile was thin but present. What choice does one have? Geoffrey would have expected no less. He was a great believer in maintaining appearances. Again, that curious phrasing, not Geoffrey valued dignity, but maintaining appearances, as though the surface of things mattered more than their substance. Dorothy, who possessed an uncomfortable tendency to fill silences with chatter, launched into a discussion of the funeral service. Miss Marple let the conversation wash over her, observing instead the room itself. There, beside the fireplace, stood a leather wingback chair, Geoffrey Stroud's chair, almost certainly. The leather was worn at the arms where hands had rested, and beside it stood a small table with a crystal ashtray, though the room smelled faintly of lavender rather than tobacco. On the table sat a single teacup, delicate bone china with a pattern of roses. That was Geoffrey's favorite, Mrs. Stroud said, noticing the direction of Miss Marple's gaze. I haven't had the heart to move it yet. Foolish, I suppose. Not at all, Miss Marple murmured. We all have our ways of remembering. But it struck her as odd nonetheless. The cup was positioned as though someone had just set it down, yet it gleamed spotlessly clean. No tea stain, no residue. It was a prop in a carefully staged scene, though whether the staging was for Mrs. Stroud's own benefit or for visitors, Miss Marple could not yet determine. Had Mr. Stroud been unwell long? She asked with the gentle directness that elderly ladies were permitted. I understand it was his heart. Mrs. Stroud's teacup rattled ever so slightly against its saucer. No, not long at all. In fact, he had seemed quite himself until recently, but then he became difficult. Difficult? Dorothy leaned forward with interest. Moody, irritable. He worried constantly about finances, though I assured him we were perfectly comfortable. Mrs. Stroud set down her cup with care. Dr. Penrose suggested it might be a symptom of his condition. The heart affects the nerves, apparently. How distressing for you, and for him, of course. Yes. Mrs. Stroud's gaze drifted to the window where the garden lay in autumn browns and golds. Geoffrey loved that garden. He spent hours there, even when the weather turned cold. I would beg him to come in, but he insisted the work needed doing. A man who knew his own mind, Miss Marple observed. Oh, yes. Geoffrey always knew precisely what he wanted. The words were delivered without inflection, but Miss Marple detected something beneath them. Resignation, perhaps, or something darker. The conversation turned to lighter matters. The village harvest festival, the new curate's sermons, the scandal of Mrs. Henderson's prize marrow being suspiciously large. But Miss Marple found her attention returning to that pristine teacup, to the almost excessive orderliness of the room, to the way Emily Stroud's fingers trembled when certain subjects arose. Tell me, Miss Marple said, as though the thought had just occurred to her. Had Mr. Stroud made any changes to his routine before he passed? Sometimes these little alterations can be significant. Mrs. Stroud's hands stilled in her lap. Changes? No, I don't believe so. He was a creature of habit. Every evening he would take a glass of port in his study after dinner. Every morning he would walk to the post office for his newspaper. He was remarkably regular in his habits. Except when he wasn't, Miss Marple said gently. The widow's head came up sharply. I beg your pardon? You said he had become moody, worried about finances. That suggests a departure from his usual temperament, does it not? For a moment, something flickered in Emily Stroud's eyes. Alarm, perhaps, or calculation. Then she smiled, though it did not quite reach her eyes. Yes, of course. How perceptive of you, Miss Marple. Yes, Geoffrey had been different these past few months, more withdrawn. I suppose I should have insisted he see Dr. Penrose sooner. One cannot always predict these things, Miss Marple said comfortingly. Hearts are such mysterious organs. Indeed they are. As they took their leave a quarter-hour later, Miss Marple paused in the hallway. Through a half-open door, she glimpsed what must be Geoffrey Stroud's study. Dark wood paneling, leather-bound books, a massive desk, and there, just visible, was the chair where he had died. Such a shock it must have been, finding him there. Alice found him, Mrs. Stroud said quickly. I had already retired for the evening. The poor girl was quite beside herself, naturally. And you sent for Dr. Penrose at once? Yes, that is. Mrs. Stroud hesitated. Geoffrey was already gone when I reached him. There seemed little point in haste, Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, though she filed away the curious phrasing, already gone, not dying, not struggling, but gone. Chapter 3. The Doctor's Note. Miss Marple had always found that the best time to call upon a doctor was in the late morning, after the rush of early patients, but before lunch made everyone irritable. Dr. Penrose's surgery occupied a pleasant brick building on the High Street, with a brass plate polished to military brightness and a front garden that showed evidence of careful if uninspired maintenance. The waiting room held only one other. Patient, an elderly gentleman with a wheeze, who eyed Miss Marple with the suspicion that the chronically unwell often reserved for the apparently healthy. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly and picked up a 3-month-old copy of the Illustrated London News. She had not long to wait. Dr. Penrose proved to be a man in his mid-50s, stout and balding, with the comfortable manner of a country physician who had seen most things and been surprised by very few of them. He greeted Miss Marple with professional courtesy tinged with curiosity. Miss Marple, isn't it? Mrs. Peaton's cousin. I trust you're not unwell? No, indeed, doctor. I'm quite disgracefully healthy for my age. Miss Marple settled into the chair across from his desk. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I wish to speak with you about Mr. Stroud's death. I am staying with Mrs. Stroud's friend, you see, and naturally one wonders about such a sudden loss. Dr. Penrose's genial expression flickered with something that might have been discomfort. He reached for a pen on his desk, turned it over in his fingers, then set it down again. "A tragic business," he said. "But these things do happen, Miss Marple. The heart is an unpredictable organ, so I have heard said. You had been treating Mr. Stroud for heart trouble?" The doctor hesitated, only for a moment, but Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime observing the small betrayals of the human face, noted it well. Not exactly treating, no. Stroud was not a man who welcomed medical intervention. Robust constitution, or so he believed. Refused to come in for examinations. Yet you certified the cause of death as heart failure. Yes. Dr. Penrose cleared his throat. "Though I must confess, Miss Marple, that the circumstances were somewhat irregular." Irregular? Miss Marple's tone invited confidence. The doctor stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the street where a farm cart rumbled past. "I was summoned to Fernley House that evening, rather late, past 10 o'clock. Mrs. Stroud's message said only that her husband had collapsed. When I arrived, Stroud was already dead. Had been for some time, I should say, given the temperature of the body." "How long would you estimate?" "Perhaps half an hour, possibly longer." Dr. Penrose turned back to face her. Mrs. Stroud was very composed, very calm. She said he had been drinking in his study, that she had retired early with a headache, and that the maid had discovered him when she went to collect the glasses. She asked me to sign the death certificate, said it was obviously his heart. He had complained of pains in his chest that very afternoon. "But you had not examined him?" "No. And that, Miss Marple, is what troubles me." The doctor returned to his desk and sat heavily. "I should have insisted on a more thorough examination, but Mrs. Stroud was so distressed, though she hid it admirably, and the signs were consistent with cardiac arrest. The face was flushed, the pupils dilated. There was no sign of violence or struggle. It seemed a straightforward case. Yet it troubles you." "It troubles me because I took the widow's word for it. I signed that certificate as what Mrs. Stroud herself called a mere formality. Those were her exact words, a formality." He rubbed his face with both hands. "I have been a physician for 30 years, Miss Marple. I should not have been so careless." "You're not the first doctor to trust a grieving widow," Miss Marple observed. "Nor will you be the last, perhaps. But I find myself remembering something curious. When I arrived that night, the maid, Alice, I believe her name is, was quite beside herself. She kept saying there was something wrong, that something smelled wrong. I attributed it to hysteria, but now I wonder—" "What did she mean by smelled wrong?" "I don't know. I didn't ask. Mrs. Stroud dismissed the girl rather sharply, and I was too focused on the matter at hand." Dr. Penrose met Miss Marple's eyes directly. "You think there was something suspicious about Stroud's death, don't you?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that it is always wise to question what appears too neat. Tell me, doctor, had you seen Mr. Stroud recently before his death?" Yes, actually. 3 days prior, I encountered him in his garden when I was walking past Fernley House. We spoke for perhaps 10 minutes. He was pruning his roses, very particular about them. He complained about the frost coming early, about the government, about the usual things. Seemed in excellent health, vigorous even. No mention of chest pains, shortness of breath, none whatsoever. In fact, he made a point of telling me he had no use for physicians. Present company excluded, of course. Said he intended to live to 90 out of pure stubbornness. Miss Marple absorbed this in silence. A man in robust health, gardening energetically, dead 3 days later of heart failure. It was not impossible. Hearts could fail with little warning. But combined with the doctor's unease, the maid's hysteria, and Mrs. Stroud's peculiar composure, it formed a pattern that Miss Marple found deeply unsettling. "Did you notice anything else unusual that evening?" she asked. "Anything at all, however small." Dr. Penrose frowned in concentration. The study was very tidy. I remember thinking that odd for a man who had just collapsed. No papers scattered. No signs of distress. Just Stroud in his chair and a shattered glass on the floor beside him. Mrs. Stroud said he had knocked it over in his final moments. Was there any liquid spilled? I don't recall. There was glass, certainly. The maid was sweeping it up even as I examined the body. He paused. Mrs. Stroud was quite insistent that it be cleaned immediately. Said she couldn't bear the sight of it. Naturally, Miss Marple murmured. Though whether it was natural to worry about broken glass while one's husband lay dead was another question entirely. You won't repeat this conversation, I hope. Dr. Penrose said, suddenly anxious. I would not wish to cast aspersions on Mrs. Stroud's character. She's a respectable woman, well regarded in the village. I am the soul of discretion, Doctor. You have my word. Miss Marple rose to leave, then paused. One final question, if I may. In your professional opinion, what else might cause symptoms similar to heart failure? The flushed face, the dilated pupils you mentioned. Dr. Penrose considered. Several things. A stroke, certainly. Poison, depending on the type. Some plant toxins can mimic heart failure quite convincingly. Digitalis, for instance, in sufficient quantity. Why do you ask? Merely curiosity, Miss Marple said. I have always been interested in the ways the human body can deceive us. Thank you for your time, Doctor. You've been most helpful. As she walked back. Chapter 4. A Whisper Over Sherry. The post office in Hartwell Rise occupied the ground floor of a half-timbered building that leaned slightly to the left. As though weary from centuries of holding other people's secrets, Miss Marple entered to find Mrs. Critchley behind the counter, a woman of uncertain age with sharp eyes and an air of knowing considerably more than she ever said directly. Good morning, Miss Marple said pleasantly. I wonder if I might purchase some stamps. I really must write to my nephew. He does worry so if he doesn't hear from me regularly. Mrs. Critchley produced a sheet of stamps with the efficiency of long practice. Visiting Mrs. Peaton, aren't you? Terrible business about poor Mr. Stroud. Indeed, so very sudden. Sudden? Mrs. Critchley lowered her voice, though they were quite alone. Though between you and me, there were those who weren't entirely surprised. Miss Marple waited with the patience that had served her well over many years. People, she had learned, could rarely resist filling a sympathetic silence. He'd been in here not a week before, arguing something fierce with a young man, right outside where anyone could see. Most unseemly. Mrs. Critchley leaned forward conspiratorially. The young man left in quite a state. Mr. Stroud looked like thunder. How distressing. I don't suppose you recognize the young man? Never seen him before. London type, I'd say, well-dressed but something shifty about him. The sort who'd sell you a watch that stopped running the moment you got home. And you've no idea what they argued about? Mrs. Critchley pursed her lips. Money, I should think, isn't it always? Mr. Stroud was shouting something about not another penny, and this is the last time. The young man said something I couldn't quite catch, but Mr. Stroud went pale as milk. Then the young man laughed, a nasty sort of laugh, and walked away. Miss Marple considered this. When did you say this occurred? The Tuesday before he died. I remember because it was pension day, and I was rushed off my feet. Nearly forgot about it until I heard about the telegram. Telegram? Sent that very evening. Mrs. Stroud herself brought it in just before closing time. Going to London it was. I didn't read it, of course, Mrs. Critchley added with the virtuous tone of one who had read it thoroughly. But I did notice it was signed with initials, E.S., not the full name, which struck me as odd. Perhaps it was a business matter, Miss Marple suggested mildly. Perhaps. though Mrs. Stroud looked worried when she handed it over, kept glancing at the door as if she expected someone to come in and catch her at it. Miss Marple purchased her stamps and departed with much to think about. A quarrel about money, a telegram sent in haste, and only days later, Geoffrey Stroud was dead. She returned to Dorothy's house to find an invitation waiting. Colonel and Mrs. Bantry were hosting a small gathering that evening, and Miss Marple's presence was requested. Dorothy was delighted. "The Bantrys are quite the center of society here," she explained. "Everyone who is anyone will be there. It will do you good to meet more people, Jane." Miss Marple suspected it would indeed do her good, though perhaps not in the way Dorothy imagined. The Bantry residence proved to be a comfortable Queen Anne house with more enthusiasm than taste in its decoration. Colonel Bantry, a hearty man with a military bearing that even retirement had not diminished, greeted them at the door with a glass of sherry in one hand and a firm handshake in the other. Delighted. Absolutely delighted. "Any friend of Dorothy's and all that? Come in, come in. You'll find most of the village here. We're a friendly lot, when we're not murdering each other over church flower arrangements." His wife, a plump woman with kind eyes, tapped his arm reproachfully. "Francis, really? Miss Marple will think we're barbarians." "Not at all," Miss Marple assured her. "I find that church flower arrangements bring out the most primitive instincts in otherwise civilized people." The drawing room hummed with conversation. Miss Marple accepted a glass of sherry and allowed herself to drift toward a pair of ladies who were speaking in those particular hushed tones that indicated interesting gossip was being exchanged. "Dreadfully sad," of course, one was saying. She was a thin woman in an unflattering shade of puce. But one cannot help wondering... Wondering what, Mrs. Fletcher? Her companion, younger and rather pretty, leaned closer. "Well, my dear, it's common knowledge that things were not entirely harmonious at Fernley House. My daily woman's sister works for the butcher who delivers there every Tuesday, and she says the atmosphere was positively arctic." "Marriages are so often not what they seem," the younger woman observed. "Indeed. And Emily Stroud had reason enough to be unhappy, I should think." Geoffrey was not an easy man, demanding, critical. There were rumors, but no, one mustn't speak ill of the bereaved. Miss Marple moved slightly closer, examining a rather hideous porcelain shepherdess on the mantelpiece with apparent fascination. Mrs. Fletcher lowered her voice further. "I shall say only this. A woman can endure only so much, and Emily has seemed positively radiant since. Well, since the funeral. Is that not peculiar? Perhaps it's relief that his suffering is over," the younger woman suggested charitably. "His suffering? My dear Miss Hargreaves, I rather think it was Emily who suffered. But there, I have said too much." They drifted away, and Miss Marple found herself joined by Major Morrison, the red-faced gentleman from the funeral, who had mentioned seeing Geoffrey Stroud gardening days before his death. "Dreadful business," the Major declared, helping himself to a second glass of sherry from a passing tray. "Can't get over it. Fellow seemed fit as a fiddle when I spoke to him." "You mentioned that you saw him working in his garden," Miss Marple prompted gently. "Tuesday afternoon. It was 3 days before he popped off, pruning his roses with absolute precision. Fellow was fanatical about those roses. Asked him his secret, and he said it was all in the feeding. Special mixture, he said. Wouldn't tell me what was in it." The Major chuckled. "Said if he told me, he'd have to kill me. Funny thing to say in retrospect." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "He seemed in good spirits then." "Spirits? Well now, can't say that exactly. Seemed rather preoccupied, actually. Kept looking at his watch. Said he had an appointment to keep. Didn't linger for our usual chat about the cricket." "An appointment on a Tuesday afternoon. How curious." "Thought so myself." Stroud was a creature of habit. Tuesday afternoons he always spent at home with his account books, mentioned it often enough. But that day he was in a hurry to be somewhere else. Miss Marple filed this away with the rest. Geoffrey Stroud, who never varied his routine, had broken it that Tuesday. The same day he had quarreled with a stranger about money. The same evening his wife had sent a telegram to London. The pattern was beginning to emerge like a photograph developing in solution, but there were still pieces missing, and Miss Marple knew better than to draw conclusions prematurely. As the evening drew to a close, and guests began to depart, Miss Marple found herself near the window, gazing out at the darkened street. Colonel Bantry joined her, swirling the last of his sherry. "Penny for your thoughts, Miss Marple?" "I was merely reflecting, Colonel, on how often the truth is hidden in plain sight. We see what we expect to see, and miss what is actually there. Philosophy, eh? Never had much of a head for it myself. Prefer things straightforward." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "But life is so rarely straightforward, is it? Particularly when it comes to matters of the heart." And as Dorothy's carriage bore them home through the autumn night, Miss Marple sat in thoughtful silence, assembling the pieces of a puzzle that grew darker and more complex with each new revelation. Chapter 5. The Maid. Who knew too much? Miss Marple had discovered over the years that servants knew everything worth knowing about a household. They saw what their employers wished to hide, heard what was meant to remain private, and bore witness to the small daily cruelties that respectable society preferred to ignore. The difficulty lay in persuading them to speak. Alice, the Strouds' housemaid, attended the same church as Dorothy. Miss Marple, after making discreet inquiries, learned that the girl walked home each Sunday via the footpath that ran along the river. It was there, on a gray afternoon 2 days after the Bantrys' gathering, that Miss Marple happened to encounter her. "Why, it's Alice, isn't it?" Miss Marple said pleasantly, as though the meeting were entirely coincidental. "What a lovely afternoon for a walk, despite the chill." The girl startled like a nervous horse. She was perhaps 20, thin and pale, with the anxious expression of someone who expected trouble at every turn. "Miss Marple, ma'am." Alice bobbed an awkward curtsy. "I didn't expect to see anyone on this path." "Nor I. But I find walking helps settle one's thoughts, don't you? Particularly after such distressing events as you've endured. It must have been a terrible shock, finding Mr. Stroud as you did." Alice's face crumpled, and for a moment Miss Marple thought the girl might cry. "Oh, ma'am, it was dreadful. I keep seeing him there, slumped in that chair, and the glass all broken on the floor." "You poor child." "Shall we sit for a moment?" Miss Marple indicated a bench beneath an old oak tree. "I find one feels better for sharing such burdens." They sat, and Alice twisted her handkerchief between her fingers, the same sodden handkerchief Miss Marple noted that she had clutched at the funeral. "It's been nearly a week now. Alice," she said in a low voice, "but I can't stop thinking about it. Mrs. Stroud says I'm being foolish, that what's done is done. But I can't help wondering if I should have said something." "Said something?" Miss Marple's tone was gently encouraging. "About what, my dear?" Alice glanced around, though the path was quite deserted. "About that night, about what I heard. What I smelled." She shuddered. "Mrs. Stroud says I was imagining things, that grief makes people fancy all sorts of nonsense. But I know what I experienced, ma'am, as sure as I'm sitting here." "I'm quite certain you do. Why don't you tell me exactly what happened, from the beginning?" The girl took a shaky breath. It was after dinner. Mr. Stroud had eaten in the dining room. Mrs. Stroud took a tray in her room, said she had a headache. That was unusual, but lately they'd been taking meals separately. Mr. Stroud went to his study afterward, same as always. He liked his port in the evenings, very particular about it. Always the same glass, the same decanter. And Mrs. Stroud brought it to him? That night she did, yes. Usually it was my job, but she said she would do it herself, that I should see to the dishes. I thought it was odd. She never went to the study in the evenings. Mr. Stroud didn't like to be disturbed when he was working on his accounts. Alice's voice dropped to a whisper. I heard them talking. Not the words you understand, but the tone. Her voice was low and calm, the way you'd speak to a fractious child. Then silence. And then, about 10 minutes later, I heard a crash. A terrible crash, like glass breaking. I came running from the kitchen, and Mrs. Stroud was already in the hallway coming down the stairs. She looked... Alice paused, searching for the word. She looked prepared, if you understand me, as if she'd been waiting for that sound. Miss Marple understood perfectly. And when you entered the study, he was slumped in his chair? Mm-hmm. His face was all red, and his eyes were staring. The glass was shattered on the floor beside him. But here's the thing. Alice leaned closer. There was no smell of port. The room should have reeked of it with all the wine spilled, but instead there was this sharp smell, like medicine. Or like the chemicals Mr. Benton the chemist uses. It made my nose prickle. Did you mention this to Mrs. Stroud? I tried to, ma'am. I said something smelled wrong, that perhaps Mr. Stroud had been taken ill with something other than his heart. But Mrs. Stroud spoke to me very sharply, said I was being hysterical, that grief and shock were making me imagine things. She told me to fetch Dr. Penrose, and to say nothing foolish to anyone. Alice's eyes filled with tears. She said if I spread tales, I'd find myself without a position or a reference. And with mother ill and my young brother still in school, I can't afford to lose my place. Of course not, Miss Marple said gently. You are quite right to be cautious. But tell me, Alice, when you poured Mr. Stroud's port on previous evenings, where did you get it from? From the decanter in the study, ma'am. It was always kept there on the sideboard with the glasses. And that night? Alice frowned. That night I didn't pour it, did I? Mrs. Stroud did. But now that you mention it, when I went into the study after we found him, I noticed the decanter was still full. She must have brought the glass from somewhere else. Miss Marple absorbed this significant detail. You said the glass was shattered. Did you clean it up? Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Stroud insisted on it immediately. Said she couldn't bear to look at it. She watched me sweep every piece into the dustpan, then told me to take it out to the bin straight away. Alice's voice trembled. I thought it was odd, worrying about broken glass when Mr. Stroud was lying there dead. But I didn't dare question her, not with the look she had in her eyes. What sort of look? Fierce, ma'am, almost frightening. Not grieving at all, but more like... Alice struggled to articulate it. Like someone who'd just finished a difficult task and wanted to make certain it was done properly. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the wind rustle through the dry leaves. Miss Marple's mind worked through what she had learned. A glass that smelled of chemicals rather than port. A wife who brought the drink herself, breaking established routine. A widow who seemed more concerned with disposing of evidence than mourning her husband. Alice, Miss Marple said carefully, had you noticed anything else unusual in the days before Mr. Stroud died? Any changes in the household? The maid hesitated. There was something. About a week before, I was dusting the drawing room when Mr. Stroud came in. He was holding a letter, and he looked dreadful. Pale and angry both at once. He went straight to his study and slammed the door. Later I heard him shouting on the telephone. I couldn't make out the words, but he was in a terrible rage. And Mrs. Stroud? She seemed almost pleased, if you can credit it. She hummed while she arranged flowers that afternoon. I'd not heard her hum in months. Miss Marple stood slowly, her joints protesting the November cold. You've been very helpful, Alice, and very brave to speak to me. I promise you that what you've told me will be treated with the utmost discretion. You won't tell Mrs. Stroud, will you, ma'am? Please, I need this position. You have my word. But Alice, if you think of anything else, anything at all, you must find a way to tell me. Will you do that? The girl nodded, relief evident on her drawn face. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Chapter 6. A Second Death. The news reached Hartwell Rise on a drizzly Thursday morning, carried by the London newspapers, and confirmed by a telegram that arrived at the constabulary just before noon. Mr. Harold Vane, formerly of Hartwell Rise and more recently of Bloomsbury, had been struck by a carriage in Piccadilly 2 days prior. He had died instantly. Miss Marple learned of it from Dorothy, who had heard it from Mrs. Bantry, who had it directly from the Colonel, who maintained excellent connections with the local police force. An accident, they're saying, Dorothy reported over breakfast, her voice hushed with the particular tone reserved for discussing tragedy. How dreadful. And so soon after poor Geoffrey. The two men were in business together once, you know. Were they indeed? Miss Marple set down her teacup with care. What sort of business? Something to do with imports. I believe Geoffrey handled the financial side and Vane managed the operations, but they dissolved the partnership several years ago. There was some unpleasantness, though. I never learned the details. You know how men are about business matters, Miss? Marple knew rather more about men and business matters than Dorothy suspected, having observed over the years that financial disputes tended to breed the bitterest enmities. How unfortunate. Had Mr. Vane remained in the village? No, he moved to London shortly after the partnership ended. I don't believe he'd been back to Hartwell Rise since, at least not until recently. Miss Marple's attention sharpened. Recently? Mrs. Critchley at the post office mentioned seeing him about a fortnight ago. He was standing outside looking at Fernley House, just standing there, staring. She thought it peculiar enough to remark upon 2 weeks ago, which would have been just before. Geoffrey Stroud received that letter that had sent him into such a rage, Miss Marple filed this away with a growing collection of significant facts. After breakfast, she suggested a walk into the village. Dorothy, who had correspondence to attend to, waved her off cheerfully. Miss Marple made her way to the High Street, where she found Constable Brewer emerging from the police station with a set expression that suggested official concerns weighed upon him. "Good morning, Constable," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Such distressing news about Mr. Vane. I understand he was once a resident here." Constable Brewer, a solid man in his 40s, with the methodical manner of one who followed regulations to the letter, touched his cap respectfully. "Morning, Miss Marple." "Yes, indeed, most distressing. Though accidental deaths in London traffic are sadly common." "I suppose they are. Had Mr. Vane family here, someone who should be notified?" "No family that I'm aware of. He was a bachelor, kept to himself mostly." The constable hesitated, then added, "There was one curious thing, though. When they went through his effects, they found a bank receipt showing he deposited a substantial sum just the day before he died. $500. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose. $500 was indeed substantial. How fortunate for him, though I suppose it profits him little now. I don't imagine you know where such a sum came from?" "Funny you should ask." Constable Brewer glanced around, then lowered his voice. The receipt showed it was a check from a local account. "I made some inquiries, routine, you understand, and it seems the check was drawn on Mrs. Stroud's account at the village bank." "Mrs. Stroud?" Miss Marple contrived to look mildly surprised. "How very odd. That's what I thought. So I called at Fernley House yesterday to ask about it. Mrs. Stroud was quite forthcoming, said it was an old debt from her late husband's business dealings with Vane. She'd only just discovered the paperwork among Geoffrey's effects, and felt it her duty to settle the account. Very proper of her, I thought. Very proper indeed, Miss Marple agreed, though it seemed a considerable sum for an old business debt. Mrs. Stroud said her husband had kept poor records in his later years. She wanted to do the right thing. The constable shifted his weight. No reason to doubt her word, is there? Respectable woman. Well thought of in the village. No reason at all, Miss Marple said gently, though she could think of several reasons. None of which she cared to voice to a constable who clearly preferred his world ordered and explicable. After parting from Constable Brewer, Miss Marple made her way to the lending library, a small establishment run by Miss Pemberton, no relation to Dorothy, who possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of village affairs and a passion for detective novels. "Miss Marple," she exclaimed. "How delightful! I've just received the new Dorothy Sayers. Shall I set it aside for you? How kind, though I wonder if I might ask you something first. You've lived in Hartwell Rise for many years, haven't you?" "All my life, I'm afraid. 43 years in the same house." "Then you would remember the business partnership between Mr. Stroud and Mr. Vane. What caused it to end?" Miss Pemberton's eyes lit with the gleam of one invited to share treasured knowledge. "Oh, that was quite the scandal at the time. There were accusations of financial irregularities, money missing from the accounts. Vane claimed Stroud had embezzled funds. Stroud claimed Vane was trying to cover his own incompetence. It went to solicitors, but nothing was ever proven conclusively. In the end, they simply dissolved the partnership. Stroud paid Vane a settlement, though whether it was compensation or simply to make him go away, no one could say." "And Mr. Vane bore a grudge?" "Oh, most certainly. He made several rather intemperate remarks before leaving for London. Said Stroud would regret cheating him, that he had proof of wrongdoing that would ruin Stroud's reputation if it ever came to light." Miss Pemberton leaned closer. "Of course, nothing ever did come to light. Perhaps the proof didn't exist," Miss Marple said softly. "Or perhaps Mr. Vane was waiting for the right moment to use it." "Precisely. And now both men are dead within a week of each other. Rather extraordinary, don't you think?" Miss Marple thought it extraordinary indeed. She thought of Alice's description of Geoffrey Stroud's rage upon receiving a letter. She thought of the quarrel outside the post office with a younger man whom no one recognized. She thought of Emily Stroud's telegram to London sent the very evening of that quarrel, and now Harold Vane was dead, struck by a carriage in one of London's busiest thoroughfares. An accident, they said, but Miss Marple had learned over many years that coincidence was often merely conspiracy wearing a respectable face. "Miss Pemberton," she said carefully, "you mentioned that Mr. Vane claimed to have proof of Mr. Stroud's wrongdoing. What sort of proof?" "Documents, presumably. Letters, perhaps, or financial records. He made quite a point of saying he'd kept copies of everything, that Stroud's solicitors might have forced him to return the company books, but they couldn't take what they didn't know he had." Miss Marple walked slowly back to Dorothy's house, her mind working through the implications. Harold Vane had possessed evidence of Geoffrey Stroud's financial misconduct. He had returned to Hartwell Rise, that revisiting a scene could yield revelations missed on first inspection. The mind, distracted by social niceties and the immediate requirements of conversation, often failed to register details that later proved significant. It was for this reason that she called once more at Fernley House, armed with the excuse of returning a book Dorothy had lent Mrs. Stroud. Emily Stroud received her in the drawing room, looking considerably more at ease than she had at their previous meeting. She wore a dress of lavender gray that softened her features, and her manner had lost some of its brittle quality. "Miss Marple, how thoughtful of you. Do sit down. Alice is just bringing tea." The room was as immaculate as before, that peculiar pristine quality that spoke of either obsessive care or careful staging. Geoffrey Stroud's chair still sat by the fireplace, the spotless teacup still positioned on the table beside it. Miss Marple settled herself and allowed her gaze to wander naturally about the room, while Emily Stroud arranged the tea things. There, on the mantelpiece, among the usual collection of china figurines and a carriage clock, stood a small cut-glass bottle. It caught the afternoon light, throwing tiny rainbows across the wall. "What a charming bottle," Miss Marple remarked. "Such beautiful workmanship." Emily Stroud glanced up, and for just a moment something flickered across her face. "That? Oh, it's just one of Geoffrey's medicines. I should have put it away, I suppose. But one becomes used to seeing things in their accustomed places." "Quite natural. Was your husband much troubled by illness, then?" "Only lately. His heart, you know. Dr. Penrose prescribed a tonic." Mrs. Stroud poured tea with steady hands, but Miss Marple noticed how she avoided looking at the mantelpiece. How conscientious of him. "I'm sure it brought your husband some relief." "Yes, I believe so." Miss Marple accepted her teacup and took a delicate sip. "I couldn't help but hear the sad news about Mr. Vane. Such a dreadful coincidence, 2 deaths in such quick succession." "You knew him, I understand." Mrs. Stroud's cup rattled slightly against its saucer. "Harold Vane." "Yes, he was Geoffrey's business partner many years ago. I hadn't thought of him in ages until I discovered some papers among Geoffrey's effects, a debt that had gone unpaid. I felt it my duty to settle it." "How scrupulous of you." $500, I understand. Quite a substantial sum." The widow's eyes widened fractionally. "News travels quickly in a village." "Yes, it was considerable. But Geoffrey would have wished all his debts honored. I sent the check to Mr. Vane's London address, and now the poor man is dead." "At least you have the comfort of knowing his affairs were in order?" "Yes." Mrs. Stroud's voice was barely audible. "At least there is that. They spoke of other matters. The approaching winter, the church bazaar, the new curate's rather lengthy sermons." But Miss Marple's attention kept returning to that bottle on the mantel. When Mrs. Stroud excused herself briefly to instruct Alice about dinner, Miss Marple rose and moved closer to examine it. The bottle was perhaps 3 inches tall, exquisitely cut crystal with a glass stopper. A small paper label, slightly yellowed, bore the words "Heart Tonic" in neat script. Miss Marple did not touch it, but she looked very carefully at the stopper and noted that the seal around it appeared undisturbed, as though the bottle had not been opened in some time. When Mrs. Stroud returned, Miss Marple was back in her chair, apparently absorbed in her tea. "I hope you don't think me presumptuous," Miss Marple said, "but I wonder if I might ask Dr. Penrose about that tonic. My own physician has mentioned I should perhaps take something for my heart, and if it helped your husband." "I really don't think," Mrs. Stroud began, then caught herself. "That is, I'm not certain of the precise formulation. Dr. Penrose would know best, of course." "Of course." "I shall ask him." Miss Marple took her leave shortly. Afterward, but not before noting the relief that flooded Mrs. Stroud's face as the door closed behind her departing guest. Dr. Penrose was just finishing his afternoon surgery when Miss Marple arrived. He greeted her with professional courtesy tinged with curiosity. "Miss Marple, nothing wrong, I hope?" "No, indeed, doctor. But I have a question about Mr. Stroud's treatment. Mrs. Stroud mentioned you prescribed a heart tonic for him. I wondered if you might recommend something similar for a friend who suffers from palpitations." Dr. Penrose's brow furrowed. "Heart tonic? I prescribed no such thing for Geoffrey Stroud. As I mentioned when you called before, Stroud refused to consult me about his health. He was convinced he was perfectly sound. But there is a bottle on the mantelpiece at Fernley House, labeled quite clearly as heart tonic. Mrs. Stroud said it was your prescription. Then, Mrs. Stroud is mistaken." The doctor paused, his expression troubled. "Would you describe this bottle?" Miss Marple did so precisely and thoroughly. Dr. Penrose opened a cabinet and withdrew a brown glass bottle of standard medical appearance. My prescriptions come in bottles like this, labeled by the chemist with the patient's name and dosage instructions. A cut glass bottle with a handwritten label sounds like something from an amateur dispensary, or something prepared at home. Miss Marple finished quietly. The implications hang between them. Dr. Penrose sank into his chair, his face pale. Good God, you're suggesting that whatever was in that bottle was not prescribed by me, and that Mrs. Stroud used it to. I am suggesting nothing yet, doctor, but I think it would be advisable to test the contents of that bottle. If it is merely a harmless tonic, then no harm is done. But if it contains something else? Digitalis, Dr. Penrose said heavily. I mentioned it when you asked what could mimic heart failure. It's a heart stimulant derived from foxglove. In proper doses, it strengthens the heartbeat, but in excess, it causes rapid, irregular heartbeat, confusion, nausea. The heart races until it simply gives out. The symptoms would indeed resemble heart failure, and it could be administered in a drink easily. It's bitter, but port wine would mask the taste quite effectively. The doctor stood abruptly. Miss Marple, if your suspicions are correct, we are speaking of murder. This is a matter for the police. Not yet, Miss Marple said firmly. We have suspicions, but no proof. Mrs. Stroud would simply claim her husband procured the tonic himself, that she assumed it came from you. Without analyzing the contents, we have nothing. Then we must get that bottle. Yes, but it must be done carefully. If Mrs. Stroud suspects we are investigating, she may dispose of it. Dr. Penrose nodded slowly. I could call at Fernley House. Say I'm collecting any remaining medicines of Jeffrey's for proper disposal. It's not unusual after a death. An excellent idea. But, doctor, be very careful. If Mrs. Stroud killed her husband and arranged Harold Vane's death, she is both desperate and dangerous. As Miss Marple walked back through the darkening village, she felt the weight of certainty settling upon her. The pieces fit together with terrible precision. The letter that enraged Geoffrey Stroud, the quarrel about blackmail, the telegram to London, the doctored port that smelled of chemicals rather than wine, and now this bottle of false medicine sitting brazenly on the mantelpiece. Emily Stroud had murdered her husband with digitalis disguised as heart tonic. And when Harold Vane attempted to blackmail her, she had paid him once, and then arranged his permanent silence. But knowing the truth and proving it were very different matters. And Miss Marple suspected that the final proof would require confronting a killer who'd already shown she would stop at nothing to preserve her freedom. Chapter 8. What the Neighbors. Heard that Dr. Penrose had called at Fernley House that morning and returned with the cut glass bottle carefully wrapped in brown paper. His expression had been grim. Mrs. Stroud was reluctant to part with it, he told Miss Marple when she met him at his surgery. Said it was a keepsake, that Geoffrey had been fond of the bottle itself, but I insisted, said it was a matter of proper medical practice. She finally surrendered it, though she watched me like a hawk until I left. And the contents? I've sent a sample to a colleague in London who has access to proper testing facilities. But Miss Marple, I took the liberty of smelling it. There's a distinctive odor beneath the sweetness, bitter, vegetal. I would stake my reputation that it contains digitalis, in dangerous concentrations. Then we're dealing with murder, Miss Marple said quietly. But we still lack the complete picture. I think it's time I spoke with the neighbors. The elderly couple who lived across the lane from Fernley House were named Thornton, and they occupied a neat cottage with lace curtains and a garden that would have been the envy of the village in summer. Now, in November's grip, it lay dormant beneath a covering of fallen leaves. Mrs. Thornton answered Miss Marple's knock with the eager hospitality of one who saw few visitors. She was a small, bird-like woman with sharp eyes and the alert manner of someone who missed very little of what transpired around her. "Miss Marple, Dorothy Peaton's cousin." "Do come in, Thomas. We have a visitor." Mr. Thornton emerged from what proved to be a conservatory at the back of the house. He was a tall, stooped gentleman with magnificent white eyebrows and the slightly deaf person's habit of speaking rather too loudly. "Visitor? Ah, capital, capital. Don't get many these days. Sit down, sit down!" Tea was produced with remarkable speed, along with seed cake that was only slightly stale. Miss Marple settled herself in a chair position, she noted, to command an excellent view of Fernley House across the lane. "Such a pleasant spot you have here," she remarked. "You must have known the Strouds quite well, being neighbors." "Well, as anyone did," Mrs. Thornton said with a slight emphasis that suggested knowing the Strouds well had been no easy feat. "They kept themselves to themselves. If you take my meaning, Geoffrey Stroud wasn't one for idle conversation." "Over the garden fence," Mr. Thornton added. "Stiff fellow, always very correct, very proper, the sort who'd correct your grammar at a funeral." "Thomas," his wife remonstrated, though without much conviction. "One shouldn't speak ill of the dead." "Not speaking ill, merely speaking truth." Stroud was a difficult man. Everyone knew it. Wife had the patience of a saint, putting up with him all those years. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "I understand his death was very sudden. You must have been shocked." The Thorntons exchanged a glance. Mrs. Thornton set down her cup with a decisive click. "Since you asked, Miss Marple, there were some peculiar circumstances. Thomas and I have discussed it between ourselves, but one hesitates to voice suspicions." "What sort of peculiarities?" "The night he died," Mrs. Thornton said, lowering her voice though they were quite alone, "we heard raised voices from Fernley House, shouting, in fact, a man's voice angry and loud." "What time was this?" "Just after 9 o'clock. I remember because the church clock had struck, and I remarked to Thomas that it was early for bed, but my eyes were growing tired." Mr. Thornton nodded vigorously. "Heard it clear as day." Stroud was in a rare temper. Couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Fury, that's what it was. Then a door slammed so hard it rattled our windows. "Could you tell what he was angry about?" "Something about betrayal, I think, and certainly money, perhaps." But the words were muffled. What struck me most was that we heard no other voice. If he was arguing with someone, they were speaking too quietly to hear. Or perhaps, Miss Marple suggested gently, he was shouting at someone who chose not to respond. Mrs. Thornton's eyes widened. "Exactly." So I said the same to Thomas. It put me in mind of our neighbor in Dorset years ago. Dreadful man who would berate his poor wife while she stood silent and took it. That's what it sounded like. And after the door slammed, silence for a bit. Then, perhaps 20 minutes later, we heard another sound, a crash, like something breaking. Thomas wanted to go over and inquire if all was well, but I said it wasn't our place to interfere. "Quite right," Mr. Thornton said, though he sounded regretful. "Still, one wonders if we might have helped somehow." Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. "Mrs. Stroud told the doctor that she had retired early that evening with a headache, that she knew nothing until the maid discovered her husband in his study. Another significant glance passed between the Thorntons. Mrs. Thornton twisted her wedding ring, a nervous gesture that spoke volumes. "Miss Marple, I don't wish to contradict Mrs. Stroud, who has always been perfectly cordial to us, but that cannot be entirely accurate." "How so?" "Because the light in the study burned until nearly midnight," Mr. Thornton declared. "I was up late myself, troubled by indigestion, if you must know, and I stood at the window having a pipe. The study window faces this direction, you see." The curtains were drawn, but light showed clearly around the edges. "Someone was in that room for hours after Stroud died." "You're quite certain it was the study?" "Positive. I know the layout of the house as well as my own. The drawing room is dark. The dining room is dark. But the study, which is where they found him, had its lamp burning bright until well past 11 o'clock, Mrs. Thornton added quietly. And shortly before the light finally went out, we saw a shadow pass across the curtains, someone moving about in that room, someone who remained there long after Geoffrey Stroud was dead. Miss Marple sat back, absorbing this information. Emily Stroud had claimed she went straight to bed, knew nothing until Alice discovered the body. But the neighbors had seen light in the study for hours, had seen someone moving about, someone who had not summoned help, had not cried out, had simply waited in that room with the dead man. Did you mention this to the constable? Mr. Thornton shook his head, seemed indelicate. The poor woman had just lost her husband. We convinced ourselves there must be some innocent explanation. Perhaps the maid had been cleaning, or Mrs. Stroud had been going through papers. But it did seem odd. Very odd indeed, Miss Marple murmured. There's one more thing, Mrs. Thornton said hesitantly. The morning after, when Dr. Penrose arrived, we saw Alice taking something out to the dustbins. She moved so quickly, almost furtively, and Mrs. Stroud stood at the window watching her to make certain the task was completed. Could you see what Alice was carrying? Not clearly. Something wrapped in newspaper, I think, but the way she hurried, and the way Mrs. Stroud watched. Chapter 9. The Truth at the Garden Gate. The telegram from Dr. Penrose's London colleague arrived on Friday morning. Miss Marple read it in Dorothy's sitting room, the thin paper crackling between her fingers. Analysis complete. Stop. Sample. Contains digitalis in lethal concentration. Stop. Estimate. Sufficient to cause cardiac arrest in healthy adult. Stop. Advise immediate police. Action. Stop. Miss Marple folded the telegram carefully and placed it in her handbag. The time for gathering evidence had passed. Now came the most delicate part of any investigation, the confrontation. She found Emily Stroud in the garden behind Fernley House, precisely where she had hoped. The widow wore gardening gloves and carried a pair of secateurs, standing among the rose bushes that Geoffrey Stroud had tended with such fierce devotion. The roses were dormant now, their canes cut back for winter, but Emily moved among them with an air of quiet possession, as though claiming territory that had long been denied her. Mrs. Stroud, Miss Marple called gently from the gate. Might I have a word? Emily turned, and something in her expression suggested she had been expecting this visit, perhaps even waiting for it. Miss Marple, how persistent you are. There was no warmth in her voice, but no particular hostility either, only a kind of weary resignation. I suppose you had better come in. They walked together along the gravel path, past the dormant flower beds and the neat vegetable garden. Miss Marple noted how Emily's hand trembled slightly as she removed her gloves, though whether from fear or cold was impossible to say. This was Geoffrey's domain, Emily said, gesturing to the roses. He would spend hours here, pruning and feeding and fretting over every leaf. I was never permitted to touch them. He said I hadn't the proper understanding. Yet here you are, tending them now. Yes, rather ironic, isn't it? Emily's smile was brittle. I find I know more about roses than he ever credited. One learns a great deal by watching, even when one is not allowed to participate. Miss Marple stopped. Beside a particularly magnificent climbing rose, its thick canes trained along a trellis, one also learns about other things. Digitalis, for instance, foxglove. It grows quite commonly in English gardens. Emily went very still. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind rustling through the bare branches overhead. I wondered when you would arrive at that, she said finally. You've had the tonic analyzed, I presume. Dr. Penrose sent it to London. The results came this morning. Miss Marple drew out the telegram and held it so Emily could read it. It contained enough digitalis to kill a man, Mrs. Stroud, quite deliberately and carefully measured. Emily read the telegram without visible emotion, then handed it back. I see. And now you've come to hear me confess, I suppose, or to warn me that the police are on their way. I've come, Miss Marple said gently, to understand, because I think there is more to this story than simple murder for gain. Something flickered in Emily's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or a kind of desperate hope that someone might finally understand. She turned away, staring at the house that had been her prison for 20 years. Geoffrey was a cruel man, Miss Marple. Not violently cruel. He never struck me, never raised his hand. But there are other ways to inflict pain. 20 years of criticism, of belittlement, of being told I was foolish, incompetent, worthless. 20 years of watching every penny I spent, accounting for every moment of my time, being made to feel like an unwelcome guest in my own home. That must have been very difficult. Difficult? Emily's laugh was harsh. It was suffocating. But one endures, doesn't one, because society says one must, because divorce is scandalous and expensive, because where else was I to go? A woman of 50 with no income of her own. She turned back to Miss Marple, her face pale but composed. So yes, I killed him. I ground the foxglove leaves to powder. His own roses weren't sufficient for my purposes, but foxglove grows wild along the riverbank. I extracted the poison over several weeks, following instructions I found in an old herbal. I added it to his port that night, brought it to him myself, and watched him drink it. And then you waited, Miss Marple said quietly. You listened to him shout at you. The neighbors heard him, but you said nothing. You simply left him to die. He accused me of trying to poison him. Emily's voice was almost wondering. Can you imagine? Some instinct warned him, I think. Or perhaps the taste was off. He raged at me, said I was a murdering witch, said he would see me hang. But by then the poison was already working. His face was flushed, his heart racing. I told him quite calmly that yes, I had poisoned him, and that no one would ever know because it would look exactly like heart failure. Then I left him there and closed the door. Miss Marple felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. And Harold Vane? Emily's expression hardened. Harold Vane was a blackmailer and a parasite. He discovered what I had done. I don't know how. Perhaps he found the letter Geoffrey had written to his solicitor changing his will, cutting me out entirely. Geoffrey had been so enraged by some suspicion that he'd rushed to make arrangements. Vane must have intercepted it somehow, or learned of it. He came to me after the funeral and said he knew, said he would tell the police unless I paid him. So you paid him $500. I paid him once. But men like Vane are never satisfied, are they? He sent another letter demanding more money. I knew it would never end. Emily met Miss Marple's eyes directly. So I followed him to London. I watched his habits, learned his routes, and one evening when he stepped into the street, I ensured that a carriage was coming at precisely the right moment. A slight push, nothing more. An unfortunate accident in London traffic. You killed twice then, once from desperation, once from calculation. I killed twice to be free, Emily said fiercely, and I won't apologize for it. Geoffrey made my life a living hell, and Vane would have sent me to the gallows. I did what I had to do to survive. Miss Marple looked at this woman who had murdered her husband with poison and her blackmailer with cunning, and felt the familiar weight of moral complexity. Emily Stroud was both victim and killer, both prisoner and executioner. I understand your suffering, Miss Marple said slowly. I even understand your desperation. But Mrs. Stroud, you must see that this cannot be excused. You took 2 lives, however miserable your own had been. The law makes no allowance for cruelty endured when the answer is murder. Emily's shoulders sagged. I know. I've known since the moment I ground those foxglove leaves. But tell me, Miss Marple, what would you have done in my place? Endured another 20 years? Died first, perhaps by my own hand? Or fought back the only way I knew how? I would have left him, Miss Marple said simply. Scandal and poverty would have been preferable to murder, because now, my dear, you face not freedom, but prison or worse. Emily removed her wedding ring and looked at it for a long moment. Will you let me go quietly? I could leave tonight, disappear. You needn't say anything until morning. And where would you go? How long before the questions caught up with you? Miss Marple shook her head. No, Mrs. Stroud, the only path left is the honest one. Constable Brewer must be told? Then I'm lost. You were lost the moment you chose this course, but there is still dignity in facing the consequences of one's actions. Chapter and the Widow's Confession. Miss Marple had sent word to Constable Brewer to call at Fernley House that evening. She had not specified the reason, only that it concerned the death of Geoffrey Stroud and required immediate attention. The constable, who had learned over the years that elderly ladies who spoke in such measured tones were not to be dismissed, had agreed to come at 7:00. Emily Stroud spent the intervening hours putting her affairs in order. Miss Marple, who remained at the house, partly from a sense of duty and partly from concern that the widow might attempt flight or worse, watched. As Emily moved through the rooms with methodical purpose, she wrote letters to her solicitor and to her cousin in Bath. She gave Alice detailed instructions about the house and a month's wages in advance. She changed into a dress of dark blue wool, simple and dignified. I won't give them the satisfaction of seeing me disheveled, she said when she came downstairs. Geoffrey always said I had no sense of proper appearance. I shall prove him wrong in this at least. They sat in the drawing-room where lamplight cast long shadows across the walls. The house was silent except for the ticking of the carriage clock on the mantelpiece and the occasional creak of old timber settling. Tell me, Emily said suddenly. How did you know? Was it the tonic bottle? That was the final confirmation, Miss Marple replied, but I suspected from the beginning. There were too many inconsistencies, too many careful evasions. You avoided speaking of your husband's final moments. The doctor had not properly examined the body. The maid spoke of a strange smell. And then there was the telegram to London, sent the evening your husband quarreled with Harold Vane about money. I thought I had been so careful. Emily's voice held a note of wonder. Every detail planned, every piece of evidence disposed of. How did it all unravel? Because human behavior is never quite as consistent as we imagine. You could not help being relieved that Geoffrey was dead, even while playing the grieving widow. You kept his chair and teacup as props in a performance, but they were too perfect, too clean. You insisted the broken glass be swept up immediately, before anyone could examine what it had contained. And you remained in the study for hours after he died, making certain everything appeared natural. But the neighbors saw the light burning, and wondered why a bereaved wife would spend so long alone with her husband's body. Emily closed her eyes. I thought if I stayed in character, if I never faltered in my grief, no one would question it. Women are expected to be emotional and irrational in bereavement. I believed composure would seem like courage rather than calculation. It might have done, if not for Harold Vane. His death was one coincidence too many. A blackmailer conveniently killed just after receiving payment. It raised questions that would not otherwise have been asked. I had no choice about Vane. He would have bled me dry and then turned me in anyway. Men like that have no honor. Emily opened her eyes and looked directly at Miss Marple. Do you think I'm wicked? It was the question Miss Marple had been expecting, the question that lay at the heart of every murder she had encountered. What separated the merely desperate from the truly evil? Where did justice end and vengeance begin? "I think you were very human," Miss Marple said carefully, "and very foolish. Human because you endured cruelty until you could endure no more, and responded with the violence that had been done to your spirit. Foolish because you believed murder could set you free, when in truth it has only trapped you more completely than Jeffrey ever did. At least I had a few weeks of peace, a few weeks of living in my own house without fear, without constant criticism. That was worth something, was it? Was it worth 2 deaths and your own damnation?" Emily looked away. "I don't know anymore. When I was grinding those foxglove leaves, when I was extracting the poison, I felt powerful for the first time in 20 years. Jeffrey had made me feel small and worthless for so long. But in that moment, I held his life in my hands. I was the one with power. Power that corrupted you?" "Absolutely," Miss Marple observed. "Because once you had killed Jeffrey, killing Vane became merely practical. The first murder opened a door you could not close again." "Yes." The admission was barely audible. "It was easier the second time. I felt nothing when I pushed him into that carriage's path. Only relief that the problem was solved." The carriage clock struck 7, its chimes falling into the heavy silence. A few minutes later, they heard footsteps on the gravel drive, and then Alice's voice in the hall announcing, "Constable Brewer." The constable entered with his usual stolid manner, but his eyes were sharp as they moved from Miss Marple to Emily Stroud. "You wish to see me, Miss Marple? Your note suggested some urgency. Please sit down, Constable. Mrs. Stroud has something she wishes to tell you." Miss Marple looked at Emily expectantly. For a moment, Emily said nothing. Miss Marple wondered if she would deny everything, force them to prove the charges through the cold machinery of justice. But then Emily straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin, with that same dignity she had shown at the funeral. "Killed my husband," she said clearly. "I poisoned him with digitalis on the evening of October 24th, and I killed Harold Vane in London on November 1st, pushing him into the path of a carriage to prevent him from blackmailing me about Jeffrey's murder." Constable Brewer's face went pale, then flushed dark red. "Mrs. Stroud, I must warn you that anything you say—" "I understand perfectly well, Constable. I'm confessing to 2 murders, committed with premeditation and carried out with deliberate intent. Miss Marple has the evidence." She gestured to Miss Marple's handbag where the telegram lay folded. "The bottle on my mantelpiece contained the poison I used. Dr. Penrose had it analyzed in London." Good Lord. The constable fumbled for his notebook, his hands shaking slightly. "Mrs. Stroud, I must place you under arrest. You'll need to come with me to the station." "Of course. I've prepared a few things." Emily stood with perfect composure. "Might I have a moment to collect my coat and say goodbye to Alice?" Constable Brewer looked uncertainly at Miss Marple, who nodded. "I shall accompany Mrs. Stroud," she said. "You need not worry that she will attempt to flee." They went upstairs together, Emily moving slowly as though savoring these final moments of freedom. In her bedroom, she took a small traveling case from the wardrobe and placed a few essential items inside. Then she turned to Miss Marple with an expression of desperate appeal. "Will you do something for me? When this is all over, when it's finished, will you tell people that Jeffrey drove me to it? That I wasn't simply a murderous woman, but someone who had suffered terribly?" "I will tell the truth," Miss Marple said gently. "That you endured cruelty? Yes, but also that you chose murder rather than any of the other paths available to you. Both things are true, Mrs. Stroud, and both must be acknowledged. Will anyone understand?" "Some will. Others won't, but understanding is not the same as excusing. You took 2 lives, and for that, you must answer." Emily nodded slowly, then picked up her case. They descended the stairs to find Alice weeping in the hallway, having grasped something of what was transpiring. Emily embraced the girl briefly. "You are a good servant and a kind soul, Alice. Thank you for your loyalty." Then she turned to Constable Brewer. "I'm ready." They walked out into the November night, where a cold wind had begun to blow from the north. Miss Marple watched as the constable handed Emily into his carriage, her dignity unbroken even in this moment of complete defeat. Later, back at Dorothy's house, Miss Marple stood by the window looking out at the darkened village. Dorothy, who had heard the shocking news, pressed a cup of tea into her hands. "How dreadful, Jane. How absolutely dreadful. Poor Emily." "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly, "though I think we must also say poor Geoffrey and poor Harold Vane. However unpleasant they may have been, they did not deserve murder. But surely there were extenuating circumstances. 20 years of cruelty are not justification for murder. Once we begin making exceptions, Dorothy, once we excuse one crime too gently because we sympathize with the murderer's suffering, we make room for the next. Justice must be absolute, even when it breaks our hearts to enforce it. You sound very certain. I am certain, because I have seen what happens when we let sympathy override.